Since 2018, ESPN has been the home for UFC across all platforms, but with the exclusive negotiating window set to end tomorrow, all signs are pointing to the two parties leaving without a new deal. While this doesn't necessarily mean that the UFC won't stay on ESPN, it definitely opens the door for the UFC to start negotiating with other companies. And by other companies, I mean the big dogs with deep pockets: Netflix, Amazon Prime Video, and Warner Bros. Discovery. Don't just take it from me either. Here's Dana White on Saturday night talking about their future with ESPN.
When the window opens, we'll obviously start, talking to lots of different people, and we'll see what the options are out there. We've said this every time. There could be a time when we end up on several different networks, like sports, like all other sports do. I like ESPN, and I've said it many times. We had a bit of a rocky start, which is normal in any relationship, but we're in a great place with ESPN. Whether we re-sign with them or do not, I have nothing but great things to say about my time at ESPN.
Needless to say, this is a big deal, even if you don't care about the UFC. The final number and deal structure will impact TKO's stock price, the newly formed company that houses the UFC, WWE, and other sports assets. This deal will also have impacts in the broader world of sports media rights, since rights renewals for other leagues are on the horizon. I'm not trying to exaggerate, but depending on who wins the rights, the UFC could be the single most valuable piece of sports content on all of streaming. This is because the UFC is an incredibly unique asset that's also incredibly hard to value. While other sports leagues like the NFL and NBA try to avoid controversy like the plague, the UFC almost runs towards it. There's the obvious stuff, like fighter pay lawsuits or Dana White's close friendship with President Trump. But rather than holding the UFC back, these types of controversial things have turned the company into a culturally relevant juggernaut. The biggest reason? Young men. Like Red Bull or Shane Gillis, men aged 18 to 34 are absolutely obsessed with the UFC. In case you don't work in advertising, that's the most important demographic for advertisers, which also means that it's the most important group for TV networks. This is one of the main reasons why the UFC's valuation has skyrocketed from $4 billion in 2016 to roughly $12 billion today. This valuation is primarily based on four revenue streams. First is media rights, which bring in $880 million annually. Then sponsorships, bringing in $251 million a year. Then live events, adding $220 million. And finally, consumer product licensing, which is responsible for another $55 million each year. You might have heard someone say that the UFC is one of the world's fastest growing sports leagues, and it's not so far from the truth. Almost every media executive I know is extremely bullish on the business, and for good reason. Sponsorship deals are getting larger by the minute. The year-round content makes it more attractive than other leagues with dead periods during the offseason. And the sport's globalized nature, similar to Formula One, allows the UFC to take advantage of tourism budgets to generate tens of millions of dollars per event. But let's be honest, media rights represent the UFC's most significant opportunity to date. The UFC's current media rights are a little wonky because free-to-watch and pay-per-view options mean they have multiple deals with ESPN. These deals currently pay about $500 million annually, and everyone knows that the UFC and Disney bundled offerings are the only things that have kept ESPN Plus afloat, helping them add 25 million subscribers since 2018. With ESPN launching its flagship direct-to-consumer app later this year, it's certainly in their best interest to renew the UFC rights. But that doesn't mean the UFC is okay with not testing the waters on the open market. An exclusive negotiated window is like selling your house off the market. If you don't open it up to bidding, how do you know the asset's actual value? If I had to guess, I'd say that the UFC will have plenty of suitors on the open market. Let's start with the fact that the UFC controls about 90% of the market share in MMA based on revenue, which means a rights buyer effectively secures the entirety of top-tier MMA with a single deal. This quasi-monopoly on elite MMA makes the UFC package highly valuable. If you want that prime young male demographic, you need MMA, and if you want MMA, you obviously need the UFC. Streaming platforms make a lot of sense because of three things. Number one, the UFC has a boatload of content with almost weekly offerings. Number two, they have a young audience accustomed to streaming sports already. And number three, the global platform allows streaming companies to take advantage of UFC's international capabilities. Reports indicate that the UFC wants $1 billion per year on its next media rights deal, and I'm betting they get every cent of it. ESPN won't pay that number all by itself, but don't be surprised if the UFC splits up its rights like the NFL or NBA, maximizing its value by dividing the number of live events between traditional TV like ESPN and a streaming service like Netflix or something like that. UFC will have to weigh the balance of reach versus revenue. If a tech giant like Amazon or Netflix wins the rights, the UFC might reach fewer casual fans than staying on ESPN, since those are closed ecosystems, and ESPN, on the other hand, has both a linear and digital hybrid presence. We've seen other leagues land on either side of the argument. On one hand, you have MLS, who prioritize revenue over reach with its exclusive deal on Apple TV. And then on the other side of the argument, you have the NFL, which does a masterful job of threading the needle between revenue and reach. Reach isn't just about availability on traditional television either. ESPN's social presence has cemented the UFC as a premium sports property, and many people don't realize that these contracts often include deliverables like guaranteed highlights on SportsCenter. Ari Emanuel, the TKO CEO and basis for the character of Ari Gold on Entourage, is known to drive a hard bargain and will look to maximize revenue while also maintaining just the right amount of reach. It's also important to remember that TKO already has a relationship with Netflix through its deal for WWE's Monday Night Raw, and the world's largest streaming platform would be a great partner if the UFC doesn't want to keep negotiating individual broadcast deals in every international country in which it operates. You might be thinking that the UFC has all the leverage in these negotiations, and for the most part, you're right, but there is at least one concern. You'll often hear that the UFC is valuable because the competition is so good. As the sport has become more popular, the athletes are better than ever. Every title fight is a toss-up, which makes it exciting. Fans will keep paying for live pay-per-view events because anything can happen. Now, while parity and unpredictability can be positive, it can also be a negative. With a constant rotation of champions, the UFC now lacks enduring star power. The league's growth in the late 2000s and mid-2010s was fueled by the same thing that grows every league: dominant, charismatic champions whose fame extends outside the league. I'm talking about people like Ronda Rousey, Conor McGregor, Jon Jones, Anderson Silva, and George St. Pierre. Nowadays, championship belts change hands so frequently, it's difficult for active fighters to achieve the same levels of stardom. From 2021 to 2023, the heavyweight, light heavyweight, bantamweight, and women's strawweight titles all saw multiple different champions in quick succession. And not all belts change hands because of a win in the ring. Francis Ngannou was stripped of the heavyweight championship belt when he left the UFC in 2023 over contract disputes. Henry Cejudo vacated the bantamweight championship in 2020 when he announced his retirement. Fighters from more than a dozen countries have held titles over the past 5 years, and some of the sport's most popular fighters, like Conor McGregor, Israel Adesanya, Jorge Masvidal, and Nate Diaz, have either had inconsistent results or are semi-retired. To make matters worse, international stars like Islam Makhachev and Khamzat Chimaev are less popular with US fans. The optimist in me would say that this isn't a problem because it just means the UFC has a deep roster of talented fighters. Rather than a rotation of stars defining an era like how boxing has operated, the UFC's recent years are defined more by its deep roster and brand than any single fighter's entertaining personality. That all might be true, and even if it is, I don't think it will necessarily impact the UFC's next media rights negotiation. At the same time, though, I also think that it's worth paying attention to. The ratio between the highest and lowest paid UFC fighters is about 300 to 1, much higher than the 23 to 1 or 70 to 1 ratios in other major sports leagues. The UFC does this because these fighters don't have a union, but they also know stars move the needle and keep people watching. The UFC's international appeal has helped broaden the sport's base, but America is still the most valuable sports economy in the world, and a constant rotation of champions presents a long-term challenge to replace the sport's water cooler buzz. So, while it's likely that ESPN and the UFC won't come to an agreement tomorrow, we can all agree the possibilities are endless when it comes to the media rights future for the UFC. But again, don't just take it from me, take it from Dana White himself.
It doesn't matter to me. It doesn't matter to me.
Right. There's been like the various, I guess, reporting out there from kind of like media reporting outlets saying the price tag you guys are looking for is $1 billion a year. Is that something you can confirm that would be?
Sounds good to me.